The air in the control room was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes before a crucial moment. Engineers shuffled between consoles, technicians called out last-minute updates, and the hum of machinery filled the room with a strange rhythm. Owen Drake leaned against the console, flipping through his clipboard. He was meticulous, a man of details, and nothing about Apollo 1 sat right with him, not since they'd rushed the launch schedule under mounting pressure from Congress. The astronauts were already in the cabin, their voices crackling over the comms. Gus Grissom joked about the cramped space, Ed White chimed in with a sarcastic quip, and Roger Chaffee, always the professional, focused on the pre-launch checklist. To most, it sounded like routine banter, but Owen caught an edge to their voices, a subtle tension he couldn't ignore. He stared at the schematics for the umpteenth time. The wiring was standard, the materials inspected, the protocols followed to the letter, or so the reports claimed. Yet, something gnawed at him. Weeks ago, during a routine inspection, he'd noticed corrosion on a cable running through the hatch panel. It was dismissed as minor wear and tear, an anomaly. But Owen couldn't shake the memory. 10 minutes to the test, a voice announced over the intercom. Owen stepped out of the control room, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The metallic tang of machinery mixed with the smell of oil and burnt wiring. He made his way to the observation deck, where he had a clear view of the capsule through a thick glass partition. Inside, the astronauts moved through their final checks, their motions deliberate but restrained. The countdown ticked closer. Then it happened. A sudden, ear-splitting burst of static roared through the control room speakers, followed by frantic shouting. "Fire in the cabin!" Owen froze, his heart lurching into his throat. Through the glass, he saw it, flames consuming the interior of the command module in an instant, a furious, voracious blaze that devoured everything in its path. The astronauts' screams pierced the air, raw and gut-wrenching, before cutting out abruptly. The fire raged brighter, feeding on the pure oxygen environment, turning the capsule into an inferno. "Cut the power!" someone yelled. "Get the fire suppression on!" another voice screamed. Panic surged through the room. Owen slammed his fists against the partition, helpless as the flames roared, consuming the module in seconds. The heat was so intense it distorted the air, creating a hellish mirage. Technicians scrambled to douse the fire, but it was over in moments. When the flames finally died down, a haunting silence fell over the control room. Owen's legs buckled and he sank to the floor, staring at the charred remains of the capsule. The once gleaming silver and white exterior was now blackened and twisted, a grotesque shell of what it had been minutes earlier. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and suffocating, as the smell of burnt metal and flesh seeped through the cracks in the partition. The door to the control room burst open, and NASA officials flooded in, their faces pale and stricken. "We've lost them," someone muttered. Owen barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on the melted edges of the hatch, where a strange, shimmering residue clung to the metal. It caught the light, reflecting faint hues of green and gold, almost like oil on water. It didn't look like any material he recognized. He forced himself to his feet and walked toward the wreckage, his mind racing. His hands trembled as he reached for the residue, scraping a small sample into an empty vial he kept in his pocket. "What the hell are you doing, Drake?" barked his supervisor, Carl Winters, grabbing him by the arm. Owen turned, his face pale but resolute. "Something's wrong here, Carl. This wasn't just a fire." Carl's expression hardened. "You saw what happened. Faulty wiring, oxygen-rich environment. It's tragic, but it's straightforward." Owen shook his head. The wiring was fine. I checked it myself. This residue..." "Drop it," Carl snapped, his voice low and cutting. "The press will be all over this by morning. We don't need wild theories muddying the waters. Stick to your job, Drake." Owen wanted to argue, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Carl turned away, barking orders at the cleanup crew. The room descended into a grim frenzy as teams began assessing the damage. As Owen slipped out of the control room, the vial clutched tightly in his hand. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't know what he'd just witnessed, but he was certain of one thing. This was no accident. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the phone rang. He picked it up, his chest tightening. A distorted voice crackled through the receiver. "Leave it alone, Drake. For your own good." The line went dead. Owen stared at the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked at the vial on his desk, the shimmering residue glowing faintly under the dim light. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. In fact, he suspected, it had only just begun. Owen Drake felt a gnawing unease as he sat in the dim corner of his apartment, staring at the small vial on his desk. The residue shimmered faintly under the desk lamp, a haunting swirl of green and gold. He'd run the basic tests in the NASA lab earlier that day, careful to keep his actions discreet. What he found left him deeply unsettled. The residue wasn't synthetic, and it wasn't a byproduct of combustion. It was organic, something alive, or at least it had been. The mystery tugged at him like a splinter in his mind, but every avenue he pursued was met with resistance. Official reports on the Apollo 1 fire cited faulty wiring and systemic oversights. NASA brass held tightly to this narrative, their press releases carefully orchestrated to minimize public outrage. Behind the scenes, however, tension buzzed like a live wire. Executives and engineers whispered about cutting corners, rushed deadlines, and mounting political pressure to beat the Soviets to the moon. Owen needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them within NASA's walls. 2 days later, Owen sat in a dingy diner on the outskirts of Houston, opposite a man named Ray Fields. Ray was a former technician for Prometheon Industries, the private contractor that supplied materials for Apollo 1. He'd been reluctant to meet, his voice shaky over the phone, but Owen had convinced him by hinting at the residue. "Look, I don't know much," Ray said, fidgeting with his coffee mug. His eyes darted to the door every few seconds, as if expecting someone to burst in. "But there were things we didn't report." "Like what?" Owen pressed, leaning closer. Ray swallowed hard. "Malfunctions, mostly. Equipment overheating for no reason. Weird noises, clicking like something tapping on metal. And then there were the guys who worked directly on the module. What happened to them? They got sick. Rashes, fevers. Some of them even had growths. Prometheon hushed it up, said it was from improper use of safety gear. But I saw the reports, man. Whatever it wasn't natural. Owen's pulse quickened. Did anyone test the residue? Analyze it? Ray nodded grimly. A few of us collected samples, sent them to the higher-ups. Next thing I know, the labs sealed off and were all reassigned or let go. They said it was budget cuts, but we knew better. Owen stared at Ray, a cold dread settling in his gut. What did they find? Ray hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. It wasn't just residue. It was alive. Not like bacteria or mold, something bigger, more complex. They said it came from one of the lunar samples. The thing had been dormant, maybe for millions of years. But when they exposed it to oxygen, Owen felt the room spin slightly. It woke up. Ray nodded, his face pale. That's why they kept it quiet. If this got out, before he could finish, the diner door slammed open. 2 men in dark suits entered, their eyes scanning the room. Ray froze. I shouldn't have come, he muttered, grabbing his coat. Forget we talked. Ray, wait, Owen called, but the man was already out the back door, disappearing into the night. Owen returned to his apartment that night, his mind racing. He pored over the information Ray had given him, cross-referencing it with internal NASA documents he'd discreetly copied over the years. The pattern became clear. Prometheon Industries had falsified safety reports. But there was something else, something darker. Buried in the fine print of an old contract was a line item for biological containment protocols, something that had never been publicly acknowledged. He stared at the vial again. If Ray was right, this residue wasn't just debris. It was evidence of something NASA and Prometheon had tried desperately to hide. The next morning, Owen made his way to the NASA Archive building, a sprawling facility filled with decades of mission records. His badge granted him access to the Apollo-era files, and he spent hours combing through technical reports, safety logs, and memos. Most of it was routine paperwork, but one memo caught his attention. Dated 6 months before the Apollo 1 fire, it described an anomalous material discovered during a test flight. The sample had been flagged as potentially hazardous, but the investigation was abruptly terminated. The memo ended with a chilling line. Further inquiry suspended under direct order of senior management. Owen's blood boiled. They'd known. His discovery was interrupted by a security guard tapping him on the shoulder. "Mr. Drake, you're needed in the director's office." Owen followed reluctantly, clutching the memo in his hand. He was met by Carl Winters, his supervisor, whose expression was a mixture of anger and exasperation. "You're digging where you shouldn't be, Drake," Carl said, his tone sharp. "Do you know how much trouble you're causing?" "I know there's more to the Apollo 1 fire than faulty wiring," Owen shot back. He held up the memo. "What's this about an anomalous material?" Carl's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is that 3 astronauts are dead, and you're covering it up." Carl leaned across the desk, his voice low and menacing. "You don't understand the stakes here. This isn't just about NASA. This is bigger than you, me, or any one mission. Walk away, Owen. For your own good." Owen stormed out, his resolve hardened. He didn't care about Carl's threats. He'd seen enough to know that something was lurking beneath the surface of NASA's carefully controlled image, a deadly truth that had already claimed lives. As he left the building, a sharp, clicking noise echoed faintly behind him. He turned, scanning the empty hallway, but saw nothing. Yet the sound stayed with him, persistent and insidious, like a warning he couldn't ignore. And for the first time, Owen realized this wasn't just a conspiracy, it was a hunt. Owen Drake parked his battered sedan a quarter-mile away from the Prometheon Industries testing facility, killing the headlights as the sun dipped below the horizon. The nondescript concrete building loomed in the distance, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. It didn't look like much, but Owen knew it held answers he desperately needed. Clutching a flashlight and a set of tools, he slipped through a gap in the fence, the faint sound of crickets masking the crunch of gravel under his boots. His chest tightened as he approached the rear of the building. The facility was supposedly decommissioned, yet he'd intercepted a recent shipment manifest listing biohazard equipment being delivered here. Prometheon was still active, and they were hiding something. The door was locked as expected, but Owen had come prepared. He knelt, using a set of improvised picks to jimmy the lock. His hands trembled, more from the weight of what he might find than fear of being caught. With a soft click, the lock gave way, and he slipped inside. The interior was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and machine oil. Owen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of abandoned desks and outdated computers. The deeper he went, the more the facility felt alive, despite its outward disrepair. Faint humming noises came from behind closed doors, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint vibration, as though the building itself was breathing. Owen followed a trail of faintly glowing hazard signs that led him to a set of reinforced doors marked "Biological Containment, Authorized Personnel Only." A keypad lock guarded the entrance, but a panel next to it was slightly ajar, exposing a nest of wires. It seemed hastily repaired, as if someone had tampered with it before. Owen carefully rewired the panel, bypassing the lock, and the door hissed open. He stepped inside and immediately regretted it. The room was massive, bathed in cold, fluorescent light that cast harsh shadows across its sterile surfaces. In the center, a large glass containment chamber dominated the space, surrounded by monitoring equipment and discarded notes. Inside the chamber, something moved. Owen froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The thing was amorphous, a mass of glistening, semi-translucent flesh streaked with metallic veins. Its surface shifted and pulsated as though it were breathing, and tendrils extended from its core, coiling and uncoiling like living cables. Pieces of machinery, charred wires, scorched panels lay embedded in its body, as if it had absorbed them. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to approach the chamber. On a nearby table, he found a stack of files and photographs, all stamped confidential. The images showed blurry snapshots of the entity in various stages of development. One report detailed how it had been found clinging to lunar rock samples from an earlier mission, dormant and harmless, until it was exposed to Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere. The file went on to describe Prometheon's attempts to study the organism. It was no ordinary life form. It could adapt to its environment, assimilating both organic and inorganic material. The report chillingly concluded that it might even possess a rudimentary form of intelligence. Owen's eyes darted to a handwritten note scrawled in the margins. "Do not expose to electricity. Reaction unpredictable." He stepped closer to the chamber, his breath fogging the glass. The organism stirred as if sensing his presence. Its tendrils slithered across the surface, leaving faint streaks of greenish residue. Owen recoiled, his heart pounding. Suddenly, an alarm blared, shattering the silence. Red lights flashed, and the containment chamber began to hiss. Owen stumbled backward as the glass cracked, splintering outward. "No, no, no," he muttered, scrambling for the door. The organism surged forward, its tendrils bursting through the cracks like roots seeking soil. A metallic screech filled the air as the glass shattered completely, and the creature spilled out onto the floor, its mass writhing and expanding. Owen bolted down the corridor, the sound of the thing pursuing him growing louder with every step. The clicking noise he'd heard in his nightmares was now unmistakable, echoing off the walls. He found refuge in a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a heavy shelf. His hands fumbled to retrieve the vial of residue from his pocket, now glowing faintly. It was the same material, the same living substance as the creature. Sweat dripped down his face as he heard the clicking grow closer, accompanied by a wet, slithering noise. He glanced around the room, spotting a fire extinguisher and a rusted crowbar. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The creature slammed against the door, the force rattling the frame. Tendrils began to seep through the cracks, probing the air like blind fingers. Owen gripped the crowbar tightly, bracing for the inevitable. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the noise stopped. Owen held his breath, straining to listen. The silence was deafening, and for a moment he thought the creature had moved on. But when he peeked through a small crack in the door, he saw it, waiting. Its mass filled the hallway, tendrils coiling and uncoiling with eerie precision. It was learning. Owen's mind raced. He couldn't stay here, and he couldn't fight it. Not with the tools at hand. He needed to escape, to get the evidence to someone who would listen. Clutching the files and the vial, he took a deep breath and kicked open the door, swinging the crowbar wildly. The tendrils lashed out, one catching him across the arm. Pain seared through his body as the flesh around the wound began to bubble and twist, veins darkening with a metallic sheen. He screamed, but didn't stop running, the adrenaline dulling the worst of the pain. He burst out of the facility into the cool night air, his lungs burning. Behind him, the creature oozed out of the building, its form stretching and contorting as it followed. Owen stumbled to his car, throwing the files and vial onto the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror. The facility was shrinking in the distance, but the clicking noise still echoed in his ears, an ominous reminder that he hadn't escaped. He looked down at his arm, where the wound was already changing. His skin had taken on a faint metallic hue, and the veins beneath pulsed unnaturally. Owen tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw set in grim determination. He had the evidence, but he also had the infection. Whatever was inside him was just as dangerous as the creature he'd left behind, and he knew this was far from over. The world outside Owen Drake's window was alive with the sounds of Houston at dawn, but inside his cramped apartment, the air was heavy with silence. He sat at his desk, the files and photos from the Prometheon facility spread out before him like pieces of a shattered mirror. His hand trembled as he traced the outline of his arm. The metallic sheen had spread, crawling up toward his shoulder, the veins beneath his skin darkening like a web of rusted pipes. Owen's breathing was shallow, his chest tight. Every movement was accompanied by a faint clicking noise, as if his bones were grinding against one another. His body wasn't just infected, it was changing. He hit the record button on the tape machine in front of him, his voice raw and shaky. "My name is Owen Drake. I'm an engineer for NASA, or at least I was." He paused, staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer monitor. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and damp with sweat. "If you're hearing this, it means I've failed, but someone has to know the truth. This isn't a malfunction. This isn't a tragedy caused by human error. It's something else, something alive." He glanced at the vial of residue on the desk, its faint glow pulsating in sync with his heartbeat. It came from the moon, buried in the rocks we brought back. Prometheon Industries and NASA. Hell, maybe the entire government knew about it. They covered it up. They thought they could control it, but they couldn't. A sharp pain shot through his arm, and he bit back a scream. His muscles spasmed, his fingers curling involuntarily. When he pulled up his sleeve, he saw the skin around his elbow had split, revealing sinew that shimmered faintly, like polished steel. "It's not just in me," he whispered into the recorder. "It is me." Owen's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. No one should have known he was here. Slowly, he reached for the crowbar he kept by his side, his grip tightening despite the pain radiating through his arm. "Drake," a voice called from the hallway. It was Carl Winters. "We need to talk." Owen didn't move. He didn't trust Carl, not after their last conversation, not after everything he'd uncovered. "I know you're in there," Carl said, his tone urgent but controlled. "I've seen the reports. I know what's happening to you, but you're not safe here, and neither are we if you don't come with me." The words hung in the air. Owen's instincts screamed at him to stay put, but he couldn't ignore the desperation in Carl's voice. Slowly, he unlatched the door and opened it a crack. Carl stood in the hallway, flanked by two men in black suits. Owen's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" "To help you," Carl said, his eyes scanning Owen's face. He flinched slightly when he saw the metallic sheen creeping up Owen's neck. "But you have to come with us now. We don't have much time." "Why?" Owen asked, his voice bitter. "So you can lock me up in some lab like the others." Carl's jaw tightened. "If we don't contain this, it won't stop with you. It's spreading, Drake. There are others. Techs from Prometheon, even some of our own people. We didn't realize how fast it could replicate." Owen's grip on the crowbar tightened. "You knew. You always knew." Carl stepped forward, lowering his voice. "It's not about what we knew. It's about what happens next. You can help us, or you can die here. And if you die, that thing inside you doesn't stop. It doesn't die with you." The words cut through Owen like a blade. He knew Carl was right. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a parasite. It was a force, a living system designed to survive at all costs. "I need time," Owen said, his voice trembling, "to record everything, to warn people." "There is no time," Carl said sharply. "We have to go, now." The drive to the facility was tense, the black SUV hurtling through empty streets under a gray morning sky. Owen sat in the back, flanked by the silent men in suits. Carl drove, his eyes fixed on the road. "Where are we going?" Owen asked. "To a containment site," Carl replied. "It's isolated, secure." Owen didn't believe him, but his body had grown too weak to fight. The pain was constant now, every breath a struggle. He glanced at his reflection in the window and barely recognized the person staring back. His left eye had taken on a metallic sheen, the pupil fractured like shattered glass. The facility was a sprawling complex on the edge of a barren desert. Owen was escorted through a series of sterilized hallways, the clicking sound in his body echoing with every step. The men in suits led him to a large observation room overlooking a containment chamber much like the one he'd seen at Prometheon. Inside was another organism, larger and more developed. It pulsed and shifted, its tendrils weaving through the remains of equipment and human remains. Owen's stomach churned. "You knew it was out of control." Carl nodded grimly. "We thought we could study it, but it's beyond us. It's intelligent, adaptive, and it's spreading faster than we anticipated." Owen turned to him, his voice rising. "You're not trying to contain it. You're trying to weaponize it." Carl didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. As the room descended into chaos, Owen's body gave its final betrayal. He collapsed to the floor, convulsing as the metallic growth consumed him. His vision blurred, but he could still hear the clicking, now deafening, echoing not just in the room but in his very skull. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the containment chamber cracking open, the organism within surging forward.